Here's everything you might have missed in Moon Knight Episode 5. Welcome back, you Marvel maniacs, to our weekly breakdown of Moon Knight. In Episode 5, Asylum gave us a heart-wrenching journey through traumatic memories, even more Egyptian mythology, and some incredible work from Oscar Isaac and his scene partner, Oscar Isaac.
So, are you two like twins?
No. Yes, sort of.
We're gonna break down all the Easter eggs and details that you might have missed in just a moment, but as always, if you prefer to read all about it, Rosie Knight has you covered over on Nerdist.com. However, in order for us to talk about this stuff, we need to spoil what's happening. So if you haven't seen Moon Knight Episode 5 yet, leave now before something catches you off guard.
Oh man. Wow, these meds are really amazing.
Now, folks, it also bears mentioning that this episode deals with some very intense subject matter, so if depictions and or discussions of abuse or trauma are difficult for you to watch, please be forewarned and take care of yourselves out there, okay? Alright, let's get into it, shall we? The episode begins almost immediately in the aftermath of Marc and Steven trying to escape the psych ward and running smack dab into Taweret, the Egyptian goddess of children and fertility. As it turns out, much like the Jeff Lemire, Greg Smallwood, and Jordi Belair Moon Knight comics on which this is based, they might not actually be in a psych ward after all.
Great. That's really cleared this whole situation up for me.
Rather, they are on a large Khufu ship sailing across the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, towards the gates of Osiris, where souls judged worthy are taken into the afterlife. The Duat has appeared several times in the comics, but this definitely feels like a fresh take on it. Taweret mentions they're not really in a psych ward after all, it's just a manifestation so their feeble human minds can comprehend it. And when talking about the many planes of untethered consciousness, she also mentions the ancestral plane from Black Panther.
Like the ancestral plane. Oh, just gorgeous.
Now, if you recall, it's the purple-hued parallel dimension where Black Panthers can commune with the souls of their ancestors after eating the heart-shaped herb. And there's also a connection to Egyptian mythology from the comics as well. With their powers waning in Egypt, two goddesses, Bast and Sekhmet, traveled to Wakanda, where they became the Panther God and the Lion God, respectively. This explanation by Taweret is intercut with Mark's repressed childhood memories and Dr. Harrow telling a bloodied, screaming Mark that he's actually in Putnam Medical Facility in Chicago, Illinois. And this is a nod to Moon Knight Volume 8, Number 11, a story in which Mark's father, Elias, who we also meet in this episode, checked him into Putnam Psychiatric Hospital when his dissociative identity disorder first manifested itself. Interestingly enough, before the big reveal, Mark says Crowley's name out loud, which marks the first time the living statue has been named as thus in the show beyond the credits. Comic fans will recognize Crowley as a homeless man who works as an informant for Moon Knight, but how show Mark recognizes Crowley's real name is anyone's guess.
And there's Crowley probably about to yell, bingo! Oh my god!
In Moon Knight Volume 8, Number 3, Crowley nobly sacrificed himself to gain passage for Moon Knight and the other captives at Amit's Asylum to be ferried across the Overvoid by Anubis. Here, though, Taweret is sailing them to Adu, the Field of Reeds, where they will spend eternity in paradise. Well, that is, if their hearts are balanced. The crux of this episode revolves around a ritual from ancient Egyptian myth, where one's heart would be weighed by Anubis against a feather, usually from Maat, the goddess of truth and justice. If the scales were balanced, they would be granted access into the afterlife, but if the heart was heavier than a feather, the soul would then be eaten by Amit. And while we've seen Arthur Harrow enacting his own version of this using his Amit-endowed powers, the ritual here is also depicted in detail in 2006's Hellstorm Son of Satan Number 3, right down to the precognitive aspect of Harrow's plan. With Marc and Steven's scales out of balance, they must frantically exhume the trauma of their past to find balance before they arrive at the gates. And what follows is a magical misery tour full of trauma, abuse, PTSD, and just the absolute worst stuff to have to relive. But hey, at least there's a QR code for free comics. Now, the first two memories are fairly recent, Mark as Moon Knight beating up the jackal monster at the museum, and Khonshu altering the night sky before he was imprisoned in his Ushapti by the Ennead. We'll come back to that third door in just a little bit, but after that, we see a version of the Psych Ward's rec room, which is full of the corpses of everyone that Mark Spector has killed in the name of Khonshu. They're surrounded by these canopic jars as well. And while they were purportedly bad people, their deaths do weigh heavily on Mark's soul. Steven then sees a mysterious child by those creepy eye drawings from the previous episode, and he follows him into another memory. It turns out the kid is Mark's younger brother, Randall. His younger sibling is seen drawing a picture of a fish with only one fin, just like Steven's fish Gus from earlier in the season. As the boys leave to go play in a nearby cave, Mark says to his mother, "Laters, Gators," which is Steven's favorite, now heartbreaking catchphrase. They pretend to be characters in their favorite movie, Tomb Busters, and go spelunking. Steven sees a dead bird skeleton on the ground that bears a spooky resemblance to Khonshu as well. Unfortunately, though, things take a turn for the tragic and Randall winds up dying in the cave. Mark's mom, Wendy, blames him and proceeds to give Thanos and Ego a run for their money in terms of bad parenting. While Mark did ultimately canonically kill his brother, it happened very differently in the comics. Randall Spector eventually became a serial killer. He was obsessed with trying to take over as Moon Knight, he was killed by the Punisher and later resurrected, and then he wound up kidnapping Mark's lover Marlene and was eventually killed by Mark himself in 2010 Shadowland Moon Knight #3. So, long story short, it's bleak any way you slice it. Now, we see numerous references to Mark Spector's Jewish faith during this episode as well, especially in the form of sitting Shiva for his dearly departed brother. In the comics, Mark is canonically Jewish, and it's nice to see them bring that backstory in here as well. This episode also introduces us to Mark's comparatively more supportive father, Elias. In the comics, Elias' story has been retconned several times. He first appeared and died of cancer in 1984's Moon Knight #37. In most portrayals, Mark is actually estranged from his father, but here his mother is much more of a dividing force in their lives instead. Elias' co-creators, Bo Hampton and Alan Zelenetz, are both thanked in the credits for this episode as well. Now, speaking of daddy issues, the next memory we experience is that fateful night where Mark was involved in the archaeological site murders that killed Layla's father, Dr. El Fuli, and all of his teammates. As we mentioned previously, this is basically the plot of Moon Knight #1, which you can read for free if you scan that QR code earlier. We see Dr. El Fuli's corpse covered in blood, still wearing the scarab-themed fuchsia scarf that Layla made for him. And while we don't get to see him as the superheroic Scarlet Scarab, he is wearing his namesake around his neck. With that said, we're still holding out hope that Layla might suit up as the Scarlet Scarab at some point, but only time will tell. Mark mentions that he was discharged after going AWOL in a fugue state, which we see happen when he walks naked through a minefield in Moon Knight #11. He also mentions that his former commanding officer was Bushman, who's the metal-mouthed mercenary that betrayed Mark in the comics and tried to murder everyone in sight. Bleeding out, we see a dying Mark lying at the foot of Khonshu's statue, preparing to put himself out of his misery. Khonshu then reaches out to Mark, saying, "Your mind, I feel it, fractured, broken, most fascinating." It echoes Khonshu's words from Moon Knight Volume 8, #2, where the moon god tells Mark the reason he's able to use him as his aspect and avatar so easily is because Mark has a weak mind. Similarly, Mark's costume in this scene is straight out of Moon Knight Volume 8, #14. When Mark agrees to be Khonshu's avatar, we hear the moon god give Mark his comic book nickname, the Fist of Vengeance. But more importantly, he finally calls Mark by his superheroic alter ego, My Moon Knight. He said it! Back in the underworld, though, things are taking a turn for the worse as we see Harrow's premature judgments of people are throwing the Duat into disarray and destabilizing things. When Mark freaks out over having to relive one particularly dark memory, he wakes up back in Harrow's office. Once again, we see a variety of eerily familiar details like a golden bust of Ammit, a new Shopti of Ammit, Harrow's trusty cane, and a painting of the Alpine Village from episode 1, to name a few. This all-white office also looks eerily similar to the tomb that Marc and Steven were in before their untimely demise. Most tellingly, though, we see a mirror that's been covered up, maybe to prevent Mark from speaking to his alters like Steven. Now, after finally agreeing to plumb the depths of his sorrow, Mark and Steven wind up back in their childhood bedroom, which is straight out of Moon Knight Volume 8, #10. We see action figures of Dr. Grant and Rosser, a Star Wars poster on the wall, a 1976 Chicago Cubs pennant, and Randall's unfinished drawing of Gus. There's even the race car bed from the comics. They really paid attention to detail here. With his mother banging down the door, Mark begins panicking, and we see the very first emergence of Stephen Grant as a trauma response. And fittingly enough, there's also a mirror right next to Mark, like every time we see these two switch between alters on the show. In Moon Knight #10, we also see the Stephen Grant alter emerge at a very young age. Here, though, Stephen was an alter that Mark assumed in order to shield himself from dealing with all the scary stuff in his life. He took the Tomb Busters motto to heart: when danger is near, Stephen Grant has no fear. Now, the movie poster itself is also chock full of Easter eggs. The movie is produced by Timely Atlas Studios, which are references to two of the names that Marvel Comics had before it became Marvel Comics. Marvel Comics began in 1939 as Timely Comics before eventually becoming Atlas Comics in 1951. The Marvel Comics brand didn't properly emerge until 1961, but the rest, as they say, is history. Now, the names on the poster are also very important. Doug Perlin is an amalgam of the co-creators of Moon Knight, Doug Munch, and Don Perlin, dating back to 1975's Werewolf by Night number 32. Melissa Russell is an actress, producer, and the wife of Moon Knight series creator Jeremy Slater. Dylan Beck is an assistant production coordinator on Moon Knight, and I'm not positive, but I'm guessing that Wyatt and Dylan Curtis are related to producer Grant Curtis. Colleen Strzelowitz is the wife of Nick Pepin, who works in Marvel Studios production and development. Noor Iqbal Molvi is married to writer Sabir Pirzada, and Amy Seward is the partner of director Aaron Moorhead. As for the rest, I'm not entirely sure, but based on this pattern, it's most likely they're all related to people that worked on the show. What follows is honestly pretty tough to watch, as we hear the sounds of Mark's mother beating him while Steven has an existential crisis over the fact that Mark created him. Through a confrontation with Mark and a brief encounter with that stupid sexy Harrow, Steven learns what we all feared. His mother is dead, and he's been making phone calls to no one. We then finally return to that memory of Mark standing alone on the street. He is in fact standing outside his childhood home while his family sits Shiva for his mother. Unable to bring himself to come inside, Mark stands below a sign for Watterson Food and Liquor, which could be named for Moon Knight co-executive producer Trevor Watterson. Drinking from a flask, Mark breaks down crying in the street until he shifts into the Steven alter, who takes over the body, and we learn that this took place roughly 2 months before the events of Moon Knight proper. We then see a cab pass by, and for a moment, I thought we might be getting Jake Lockley, the third alter from the Moon Knight comics, who was heavily teased by that violently shaking sarcophagus in episode 4 and those mystery murders in episode 3. It seemed like Jake might have finally come out to play for a little bit as well when Mark woke up with an intensely bloodied face in Harrow's office earlier in the episode. And while we've seen plenty of stabbing before, both Mark and Steven denied doing so previously, so you tell me. And while the facial bandage is right out of the comics, for now it seems like they're keeping everything else, especially about Jake, pretty close to the vest. Now, my thought here was that unlocking Jake would bring the true balance they needed, but at this point it seems like we won't be getting Deus Ex Locklina anytime soon. Maybe in a post-credit scene next week, but only time will tell what's actually inside that sarcophagus. Back on the boat, though, our heroes finally arrive at the gates of Osiris with unbalanced scales, leading the souls of the people that Mark murdered to rise up and try to claim theirs. While Steven shows off his cricket skills, he ultimately sacrifices himself to save Mark's life. And while Crowley sacrifices himself in the comics, this time Steven's the one becoming a living statue. Now, with all of that said, it is a fairly gruesome death, and I have to say, it is also fitting because Mark wound up creating Steven to protect him, and that's exactly what Steven did here. Now, moving on, it looks like that little girl in episode 1 was apparently right about Steven the whole time.
And did it suck for you? Getting rejected from the Field of Reeds?
Well, that don't make sense, because I'm not dead.
With Steven's sacrifice, Mark is well and truly alone, but that brings balance to the scales that he needed, and suddenly he's awash in golden light in the Field of Reeds, the paradise of the Egyptian afterlife. Unfortunately, Mark won't be spending too much time in paradise, because with 1 episode to go, he'll need to reunite with the world's pushiest moon deity if he wants to save the day. And the night. Because he's Moon Knight. Anyway, there you have it, folks. That's everything that we spotted in Moon Knight Episode 5. We'll have plenty of other theories, thoughts, and deep dives in the days ahead as we count down until next week's finale. In the meantime, though, folks, tell us, what did you think of this episode? Did you spot anything that we missed?
You have been at it for hours. Great work.
Let us know in the comments below, and for the latest and greatest in the world of pop culture, make sure you stay tuned to Nerdist.com.